For different types of spin, we use different flick techniques. For very heavy pure side spin underspin, it is still recommended to handle it with a push, short drop, or long push, mainly using a disguised push. Because when the spin is extremely heavy, if we rely only on wrist power, that gives the opponent a very good attacking opportunity. So what kind of balls can we flick? Weak underspin, or lightly spun side spin underspin, underspin balls, or side spin topspin, or balls leaning more toward topspin. Everyone's serve has different spin. You can try flicking to test it. If you find that every flick goes into the net, immediately switch to a push. If you feel that every push goes half long or out, then you can use the flick technique. Let's first talk about weak underspin. How to distinguish the two. First, open the racket angle a bit more. Second, when rotating the wrist, move it forward and upward. Create some arc. Let's take a look. Open the racket angle, flick forward and upward. Focus on creating arc. If the opponent serves a very spinny side spin topspin, or a ball leaning towards side spin topspin, then the flick technique changes from an open racket angle to slightly closed. The wrist movement should be more forward, not more upward. This is for side spin topspin. These are the key differences. Let's take a look. The wrist must rotate forward. Now, let's talk about power control. This also needs to be managed, because flicking is not a power-based stroke. Roughly use about 50-70 power. Absolutely do not use dead force, make the swing too big, or hit too much. Use the fingers and wrist softly. Create threat through speed and placement, not through brute force. According to different incoming balls, choose different flick techniques. During practice, train this receive point a lot. Do not practice this for the first time in matches. For more basic level players, start with balls that have slight underspin, or pure side spin topspin. Practice with relatively pure spins first. After you find the flick technique and feeling, you can truly use it in matches. So in training, we need a lot of forehand short ball receive practice. Now, let's talk about the forehand flick technique. There is a very obvious problem. Many players cannot distinguish forehand drive and forehand flick inside the table. This is flick. This is drive. This problem is very common in matches, because once they use a forehand drive, a side spin topspin serve will go straight out. After flicking out once, they no longer dare to use it. In the end, they only push. Even if the push is half high, they still won't flick. They abandon the flick technique. We must first clearly separate the two. First of all, the flick technique does not require the use of the upper arm. The forearm can move, but its force direction is forward. A common mistake is moving both upper arm and forearm upward together. This causes balls with no spin or side spin topspin to go out easily. If we can drop the shoulder and elbow, control the upper arm, control the forearm with the forearm moving forward, and then relax the wrist and flick with the wrist. This shot can solve many no spin or side spin topspin balls. During the flick motion, it is actually quite similar to a forehand drive. For example, a forehand drive goes from the backswing position to between the eyebrows. For the flick, we only use about half of that motion. After the flick, the racket stops here, not all the way up here. The second point is, in a forehand drive motion, the shot is completed by folding the forearm. But for the flick, we do not use the forearm. We use the wrist to complete half of the motion. Backswing contact. So during our usual flick training, you must remember to control both the upper arm and the forearm. Do not lift upward, and do not make the motion too large. Generate power with the fingers and the wrist. When we encounter no spin or side spin topspin balls, I will demonstrate the movement for you. If you cannot clearly separate a drive from a flick, I'll teach you a very good method. You can toss the ball yourself and hit it. By tossing the ball up, practice the wrist motion from small to larger movements. Use the wrist to control your forearm. First, make the motion smaller. First, find the wrist-based flick feeling and ball touch. This method helps you find the basic flick motion first. When the wrist starts to work smoothly and becomes more flexible, you can then add a little forearm. Then, when practicing with a partner, have them serve short to your forehand. Or use a ball machine. You can then combine forearm and wrist. So be sure to isolate the wrist for training. Once the wrist action is done correctly, the feeling of the flick will naturally come. Now let's talk about flick placement. Some of my followers told me that their flick has very little threat. In push and flick techniques, we must combine them with placement. Only then will the effect be better. For example, flick cross-court. Then suddenly, you flick down the line. You fully move your opponent. The threat and quality increase immediately. How should we flick to the three placements? It's the same as with pushing. Your racket face and racket tip. After contact, will send the ball where they are pointing. This makes it much more accurate. For example, if I want to flick cross-court, after the flick, the racket tip and face point toward the cross-court direction. If I want to flick to the middle, the racket face and tip point to the middle. If I want to flick down the line, the racket face and tip point down the line. Why can't many players open up the placement? Because before the flick, the racket face is still moving cross-court or moving forward. They do not direct the racket tip and face down the line with force, so the placement cannot be opened up. When you practice, accurately align your racket face and racket tip. Whichever placement you want, move toward that direction. Cross-court, middle, down the line. The wrist must be relaxed, especially for down the line shots. They require higher wrist flexibility and greater wrist rotation. So for over-the-table techniques, you must not grip the racket too tightly. You must fully relax before contacting the ball. Relax your grip at the moment of contact, then execute the action in time. During practice, you should train both down the line and cross-court flicks. It should be integrated at the same time. You must add placement awareness training. As long as the quality of the return isn't very high, we have the ability to rally with them and continue the exchange. So when you reach a certain level of training, you must incorporate placement awareness. The second issue is about weight transfer and footwork. Many players don't step forward when they see a short ball, which leads to a poor contact point. So first, we must ensure that, as long as the ball is on the forehand side, whether you push or flick, your foot must step in. You must step into the forehand half of the table. If you step in and it still looks like this, it means this ball is truly very hard to reach. Your weight must also fully come forward. In this situation, after dropping the shoulder and elbow, only then can I fully use the wrist to flick. Some players also fully straighten the arm. With this kind of flick, the overall movement frame becomes too large. So after stepping in, tuck the elbow slightly. And keep the upper arm closer to the body. Do not let the elbow stick out. With this kind of flicking technique, we can use our power more effectively. Some players, after stepping in, pull the arm backward before flicking. The position where your foot is planted is exactly the backswing position for the flick. You should not step in and then pull the arm back again. If the opponent adds even a little spin, you will easily be affected by the spin. Flick directly from the backswing position. Do not make a second backswing. Especially do not pull the upper arm, forearm, or shoulder backward. Step in and align directly. Then use your fingers and wrist to flick forward. These issues all require extra attention. If your forehand short ball feels difficult to step in properly, and you always feel like you can't step into position, you can put the racket down and do footwork drills without the racket. 20-30 repetitions per set, 5-10 sets per day, so that your footwork and weight transfer develop strong muscle memory. The third issue, the essence of the forehand flick, is the way the wrist rotates. Many players, when flicking on the forehand, either do not use the wrist at all, or move the wrist excessively. So what is the correct wrist action? First, not moving the wrist at all. This situation commonly occurs because players are too stiff. They flick mainly with the forearm, or even with the upper arm. The main structure should be dropping the shoulder and elbow. First, the wrist must be relaxed. Only then can it rotate. Slightly side top forward, with a small sideways rotation, or slightly side back to upward. Wrist flexibility is essential. So first, you must relax. Only then can it rotate. The third point is that the range of motion must not be too large. When flicking, the wrist should not be too loose or swing too widely. Otherwise, the ball will not be contacted solidly. So when we flick, you can see, the wrist motion is only about this big, with the wrist slightly driving the forearm forward to flick. The motion must not be too large. Let the fingers and wrist drive the forearm. Rotate flexibly and move forward. Some people think the flick is very difficult to learn. It is actually because of the forearm and wrist. Lack of wrist flexibility. Here is a suggestion. First, separate the wrist from the forearm. You can feel it first with shadow practice. You need to fully sense how relaxed your wrist is. The more relaxed it is, the easier the flick becomes. The more tense you are, the harder it is to execute the motion. Whether forehand or backhand, first relax the wrist. Then slightly push the wrist forward. Forward and upward, according to different spins. Isn't this actually a very complex technique? You can also practice by self-tossing and hitting, or through shadow training. Once the wrist is done well, the flick will basically be successful.